If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine. And maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them. From disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello, my name is Spencer, and in my podcast called The Dictionary, I literally read from the dictionary, but add in my personal comments and stupid jokes to make it more interesting. Episodes are family-friendly, short, and air every single day on basically every podcast platform. Come join me on this journey filled with edutainment.
Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
This is the podcast all about the movies you never saw, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page. My name is David Spencer.
And my name is Daniel Kaka.
All right. Well, Dan, I hear that we're jumping into a big topic, an enormous topic, a Godzilla-sized topic.
I would say so. This, without having to look at the dates, I want to ask you really quick, before I ask you about your history with Godzilla, how old do you think Godzilla is? When do you think it started?
Ooh, I think the first movie is the 50s?
Yep. 1954.
1954.
Yeah. That was something that baffled me because I know this first episode that we're going to do, because it's going to be a two-part episode just because the franchise is just so big.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to be going into primarily the history of Godzilla. And that was the thing that initially surprised me, was that it started in the 50s. And I know for us, whenever we're going through the history of something, like whenever we did any superheroes, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, they were starting around like the 20s, 30s, into the 40s. But I didn't realize that this was started in the 50s, and yet there is still an incredible amount of history that goes into Godzilla.
Yeah, is Godzilla the longest running film franchise? And I say that to mean that Godzilla is a character that was first created for film. Like, there's plenty of characters who appeared in movies before that and, you know, are still in stuff now, but like characters like Sherlock Holmes or Frankenstein, these are characters that were not created for the movies. Would it be fair to say that Godzilla is our longest running movie star?
I think so. I honestly think that is what the case is. And this is something that we have discussed before, which I feel like if any of our listeners were listening to us, when we were talking about through the 60s and the 70s, we were talking about sequels and the use of sequels and saying that, well, there wasn't really franchises back then. Someone is screaming at us saying like, Godzilla, it's Godzilla. Godzilla is the franchise. Godzilla has all of the sequels to it. So yeah, it's all in there.
You keep shouting Godzilla, and I'm just thinking about the bridge of the Blue Oyster Cult song.
Yes.
Is this just another thing that American culture has imported over from Japan? The idea of a franchise like this?
In a way, yes. But it's not just like a copy-paste situation.
Yeah.
And it's not just a send through a Google Translate type situation. There is propaganda behind this. There is a lot of political motivations behind it. There's a lot of covering things up. And I thought that part is really interesting. So I want to be upfront about this just because we're not going to be able to cover the entirety of Godzilla history. In fact, if I did, that would just be an entirely new podcast. And there are podcasts out there that are just dedicated to Godzilla alone.
Yes.
There are
indeed.
YouTube channels that are just dedicated to Godzilla and Godzilla content. We are a podcast that covers multiple movies, and Godzilla just happens to be one of them. So a lot of stuff we're going to try and get in depth into, but a lot of other stuff, like when we get into the sequel movies, we're going to kind of skim over. What I thought was so important, and I think this is going to relate to when we actually get to the unmade movie, is the transition from the Japanese original film to the US-led distribution of the same film and how the US actually handles that material.
And you're saying that that's where a lot of the propaganda and politics kind of comes in?
Yes.
That's really interesting because I know we're going to get deeper into this, but my knowledge of Godzilla is pretty thin. I don't know much more about it beyond what I learn about Godzilla from the Ultimate Showdown of Ultimate Destiny. The one thing that I had always heard, and I imagine this is going to be one of those situations where the answer is going to be, it's sort of like that, but that is way simplified. Yeah. The story I'd always heard is that some of the inspiration for Godzilla came from the Hiroshima attacks. It has a lot to do with how and why Godzilla got made. That's basically the bulk of my knowledge of Godzilla.
I don't want you to feel bad about knowing that, or like just knowing that surface level stuff, because that was my approach as well, is that I don't really know too much about the Japanese Godzilla franchise. For me, my Godzilla fandom, and I recognize that this is problematic, but my Godzilla fandom came out of the Roland Emmerich Godzilla that came out in 1998. The reason being is that when they made that film, they knew that it was going to be targeting little boys. And at that time, I was 9 years old. So I was like at that prime age where I'm like, big lizard monster takes down a city. I think it's cool.
Jurassic Park is one of the biggest franchises of the time.
Exactly.
So they're like, this is a perfect time for Godzilla.
Exactly. So that's my understanding, and that's my fandom of Godzilla, was that I really enjoyed that film. Growing up later, I actually rewatched it last week.
Does it hold up?
It's no, it doesn't. But I will say that I still enjoyed watching that movie.
Yeah.
It's so much fun.
That's going to be the way it is with anything like that from when you were a kid. Even if you know it's bad, there's still going to be parts of it that you're like, this is fun and I like this. 9-year-old me is thrilled right now, and I'm not going to let that little guy down.
It's the Space Jam effect, where we all thought that Space Jam was a great movie until we watch it again and we realize, oh no, it is not.
Yeah. Oh boy, I watched Space Jam recently for the first time in years, and that is a bad movie. That is like a shockingly dumb movie.
It is a terrible movie,
it's
but
so awful.
We think back to it and we're just like, I kind of love it.
Space Jam was everywhere. It was the thing.
Yeah. So that's what Godzilla was to me. Let's get into these notes. So,
yes,
like I mentioned before, the very first Godzilla was released in Japan on November 3rd, 1954. It was produced by Toho Studios, a studio that started off as Tokyo Takarazuka Theater, a theater production company in 1932 that was created by Hanku Railway founder Achizu Kobayashi. I probably should have stated this at the very beginning. Neither of us speak Japanese.
Yeah.
There is going to be a lot of mispronunciation. I already mispronounce names that are in English. I am going to spectacularly fail at a lot of these, but I'm going to try my best.
One thing we could say about Dan is that Dan mispronounces every name equally. It doesn't matter if it's Japanese or German or even American, it's going to get mispronounced.
It's true. It's going to happen. There's no discrimination as to who I'm going to mispronounce. For this production company, for Toho, their first film was Three Sisters with Maiden Hearts, which was released in 1935.
Okay.
Kobayashi purchased and invested in many other companies, which included the Film Processing Lab at PCL, which stood for Photochemical Laboratory. During World War II, many of Kobayashi's companies merged together and Toho Studios was created. Toho is probably famous for Yojimbo, Ran, Akira, Seven Samurai.
All the Kurosawa movies.
Yes. Every Studio Ghibli animated film. And of course, Godzilla.
Wow.
Yeah, they're like the Disney of Japan.
Yeah, I guess so. I love those Kurosawa movies for sure.
Mm-hmm. In the US, around the time that Toho Studios was getting off the ground, RKO Pictures released the 1933 epic King Kong. Mm-hmm. This film would inspire cinematographer Eiji Subahara with stop-motion special effects done by Willis O'Brien, who prior to King Kong did the effects for The Lost World in 1925, which caused Subahara to change his career path to special effects. During World War II, Tsuburaya and Toho Studios were recruited by the Imperial Japanese to help create propaganda films. He did the special effects for the 1942, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this in Japanese, but it translates to The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malaya, in which the effects were so well done, it fooled many viewers thinking that it was actual documentary footage from the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, I am like so unaware of any Japanese cinema before Kurosawa era. I feel like part of that is just because any sort of film history is going to be Eurocentric. And so like I know a lot about like early German films and stuff, but I would not be surprised if a large part of it as well was because of World War II. And it sounds like specifically how Japan was using film and filmmakers for their propaganda arm in the same way that America was doing the same thing. I would not be surprised if that's a large reason why Americans may not be as aware of earlier Japanese cinema.
Yeah, like how Donald Duck was used to help promote war bonds.
Yeah, exactly.
So the history of World War II is not something that I'm well versed in, and a subject that I plan on not dwelling on for too long, but I do have to highlight some things because it is important to the story.
Yeah.
So after Hitler and the Nazis were defeated in 1945, this left their ally, Japan, to fend for themselves. After Japan attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. retaliated by not invading Japan, but instead using atomic weapons. So on August 6, 1945, the U.S. bombed Hiroshima, ending the lives of over 100,000 casualties. And just 3 days later, Nagasaki would experience a similar atrocity. This forced Japan to surrender. What made these attacks so devastating was not the amount of massive destruction that could be caused by one bomb, but the radiation that lingered afterwards, known as the fallout. The term hibakusha was used to describe individuals that survived the bombing, but were left with scars and symptoms of nuclear poisoning.
To call it scars and symptoms of nuclear poisoning is putting it extremely mildly. If you ever see any sort of photography of what victims look like, it is extremely upsetting. I should say I have family who is Japanese. There's family who was mostly in America during World War II and grew up in internment camps in America, but also hearing about stuff that was happening in Japan at the time as well. So this is something that I did learn a lot about growing up. One of the most chilling things to me is if you ever see drawings that were done by kids around that time of what people looked like in that explosion. People covered in red scars and looking like they're bleeding from everywhere. And it's just like hordes and hordes of bloody people just trying to gasp for life for the last little bit of time they have left. Like, it is extremely horrific what those bombs did.
Yeah. In the research, like I've seen a few of the images that you were describing, and they are just haunting.
Yeah.
What the tremendous amount of damage that these bombs can do and even linger afterwards.
Atomic warfare is not good, folks.
Nope. We're going to put that on the record now. We are
anti-atomic bombs.
After the attack, Japan was under U.S. occupation and reconstruction from 1945 to 1952. A democratic government replaced the Meiji Constitution, which gave women the right to vote, and the emperor no longer ruled like they used to and was reduced to a ceremonial status. Japan could no longer wage war. Free speech was promoted, including in film, but any content that contained atomic bombs or any criticisms of the military were heavily censored.
That's really interesting because the other story that I get heard talked a lot about in regards to the atomic bombs is Akira. A lot of the themes of that movie, and specifically some of the crazy nuclear body horror that happens at the end of that, I've always heard is like, oh yeah, this is about the atomic bombs. But that's interesting to know that it wasn't a subtle metaphor for the sake of being a metaphor. It was, we cannot literally talk about it, so we have to metaphorically talk about it. That's the side of this that I had no idea of.
Now, this was not for very long. Like I said, the occupation, or the U.S. occupied Japan, was from 1945 to 1952. But
oh, okay.
This is something that people were holding inside and you couldn't publicly talk about, but everyone knew about.
That's got to be really messed up as well, because like that is a tragedy that is 1,000 times the scale of something like 9/11. And to imagine something that big happening and not being allowed to talk about it, that's tough to deal with.
It is. Japan hoped that the atomic bomb was behind them, and they no longer had to deal with the tragedy until March 1st, 1954, when the US was testing out the first lithium deuteride-fueled thermonuclear weapon in the operation titled Castle Bravo. I had to look up the specific name for it because I was like, it's an H-bomb. And I was like, but is it? It kind of is, but is it?
Boy, leave it to America to just love their weapons testing.
Yep. The U.S. detonated the bomb at the Coral Reef Bikini Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. When the bomb went off, they did not account for the additional reactions involving lithium-7, which made the blast 2.5 times larger than originally planned.
Jeez Louise.
The casualties of the radiation fallout was a Japanese fishing vessel, Lucky Dragon No. 5, where all 23 crew members experienced acute radiation syndrome. The islanders of the Bikini Atoll were also casualties of the fallout. There was also fear that the fish Japan relied on for food would be contaminated as well. The world was outraged by the actions of the US, and the US would have to pay out in damages. The relations between the US and Japan were unstable, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
Over at Toho Studios, producer Komoyuki Tanaka was put in charge of making the film Shadow of Glory in 1954. The film was about a Japanese soldier that falls in love with a half-Indonesian woman while he was stationed at the Dutch East Indies during the Japanese occupation of Indonesia. Because of Indonesia's anti-Japanese sentiment, the government denied visas for any Japanese filmmakers and actors. Because of the restriction, the film was canceled, leaving Tanaka to figure out what his next film was going to be about. Tanaka was known for constantly reading newspapers and magazines in search for his next story. On his flight back from Indonesia, after unsuccessfully trying to convince them to film there, he thought of a movie that would marry the 1953 film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which the special effects was done by Ray Harryhausen.
And under certain conditions, a nuclear explosion could free one from his icy tomb. Then, guided by instinct, the beast would come back to the caverns of the deepest Atlantic where it was spawned. An armored giant, wreaking his prehistoric fury on modern man and his puny machines. Cities would be terrorized by the cruel intruder from the past. Populations crazed and panicked with fear by its destructive force. Granite and steel would crumble. Soldiers and their weapons would be powerless before the onslaught of the beast. The beast. The beast. The beast from 20,000 fathoms.
And he wanted to tie that in with the Castle Bravo operation incident. He figured that this would be a hit, since monster movies had become increasingly popular. This was proven when in 1952, RKO re-released King Kong in theaters and ended up making more money than the first time that it was released.
Wow.
Yeah. And then his story would include the nuclear bomb aspect, since that was constantly a subject in the news.
Yeah.
Tanaka wrote down an outline to pitch when he got back to the studio, and he titled it The Giant Monster from 20,000 Miles Beneath the Sea. Catchy. Executive producer Owayu Mori checked in with the special effects director, Eiji Tsuburaya, who we had mentioned before, who did the effects for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, where everyone believed it was the actual footage. So they wanted to see if the film would be financially feasible. And when he figured out what it would actually cost, he went back to Mori, and then Mori ended up greenlighting the film. Tsuburaya used the opportunity to try out the recently adopted storyboarding system to help piece together the film before actually filming. Tsuburaya was reestablishing himself in the industry. So during US-occupied Japan, he was blacklisted and classified as a Class B war criminal, as a war exploiter, for assisting in making propaganda films. During the 40s, he had to leave Toho and worked freelance. Tsuburaya and Mori had worked previously on the 1953 Eagle of the Pacific, in which Tsuburaya used storyboarding to help plan out his special effects needed for the film, which was a technique that Tsuburaya picked up from American filmmaking.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, he got blacklisted from, well, I guess the Japanese film industry, but if he hadn't, he would have learned about storyboarding. To direct the film, Tanaka wanted Senkichi Taniguchi, but he declined. Many other directors were considered, but many of them passed thinking the idea was stupid. The offer eventually went to Ashiro Honda, who was quoted saying, "I had no problem taking it seriously." Hondo was a former student of Nihon University as part of their new film program. That's where Hondo first met Mori when he worked for PCL. Mori was looking for ambitious filmmakers to help Japan keep up with the American film industry, while Honda saw Mori as his way into the film industry. Unfortunately, Honda was drafted to serve in the military in 1934. Around the time that Japan was planning on invading parts of China and South Korea. It was in his experience in the military that strengthened his pacifist worldview. Reflecting on this time, he said, quote, "My superior officer killed a young Korean today with his bayonet. If you are a normal person in this place, you'll either kill yourself or go crazy."
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. For 6 months, Honda was held as a prisoner of war by the Chinese, in which he claims that he was treated well. When Honda left the military, he continued to work in the film industry, but would be asked to serve frequently going into the 1940s. As a memento of his time in the military, he kept an unexploded mortar that failed to kill him. He placed that mortar on his desk in his private study as a reminder of the horrors of war. Honda returned to Japan in 1946 and actually had to travel through the remains of Hiroshima in order to get to his family. He got in contact with Mori in Toho Studios to work in the film industry. Soon after, Mori was blacklisted and labeled a Class B war criminal as well for his involvement in propaganda films, and eventually came back in 1952. Honda continued working in the industry. Honda was innovative and pushed the abilities of filmmaking. In his documentary Issei Shima in 1949, he and his crew figured out a way to film underwater. Honda's first feature-length film was The Blue Pearl, which was shot similarly to a documentary.
This guy, I'm just learning about him, but he is like so fascinating to me already.
Yeah. Honda had a habit of leaving scripts on the table at home, which would indicate to his wife, Kimi, who formerly worked in the show business, to read the scripts. He liked getting her opinion on the stories, on what he was doing, and he wanted to make sure that any female characters in there felt believable. He was starting to craft his style, making stories with social issues. It was shot documentary style. He could shoot underwater. A lot of his movies involved sacrificial love and a tragic ending. In 1953, Honda was slated to direct Eagle of the Pacific, which was mentioned before with Tsuburaya, so they already knew each other ahead of time. But this was the film that brought Mori back from being blacklisted so that he could be an executive producer again. Tsuburaya had wanted to make a giant monster movie ever since he saw King Kong, but every pitch he gave to Tanaka was being shut down, including a movie about a giant octopus. So when Tsuburaya was hired for the giant monster movie of 20,000 Miles Beneath the Sea, he was ecstatic. In Japan, their only context of giant monsters was King Kong, but not just the American movie, but the Japanese parody version of King Kong that was released in the same year of 1933. 5 years later, Japan came out with a two-part film, The King Kong That Appeared in Edo, in which an ape nicknamed King Kong kidnaps the daughter of a wealthy man as part of a revenge plot on one of his lackeys. Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't see any of these films because both of them were lost during the bombings of World War II.
Wow. When you say it was the Japanese version, you use the word parody. Is it supposed to be like a parody in the vein of what Buster Keaton was doing, parodies of things like Sherlock Holmes? Or was it just a Japanese remake? Like, was it played for comedy?
From the stills that I could find, it seemed like it was a goofy type film because it was a guy who was dressed up in a gorilla suit.
Okay.
And it's kind of hard to take that seriously.
That's fair. That's fair.
To write the film, Tanaka hired sci-fi writer Shigeru Kayama, who wrote a 50-page treatment in just 11 days and changed the lengthy script name to Kiatsu Kikaku G, which translates to Development Plan G. I've seen a few reports where it's been called Project G, as in G for giant, but none of those I could actually confirm. In this version, a giant sea monster destroys fishing boats and comes onto shore to hunt for food. Honda and Tanaka were not happy with this version, especially because there was no mention of a nuclear incident, and it was way too similar to the beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Honda and Takeo Murata took the treatment and began working on the screenplay, which they finished in about 3 weeks, with input from Tsuburaya and Tanaka. They wrote a script that was more serious and included the nuclear test, which would create the monster Gojira. How the name came about isn't fully certain, but there is some speculation. The name was possibly a portmanteau of the Japanese words for gorilla and whale, which was Gojira and Gojira. Tanaka claims it was a nickname for a Toho employee, Shiro Amikura, a stunt actor who wore the Gojira outfit. Hiro Nakajima claims that Toho held a contest within the company to see who could come up with the best name for the beast, and Gojira was the winner. Kimi Honda claims that it was Honda, Tanaka, and Tsuburaya brainstorming the name altogether. It's not confirmed how this name came about, but somehow they just did.
Yeah.
Kayama, who wrote the original treatment, he was tasked with writing the novelization of the first film, which was titled Monster Gojira, which was published on October 25th, 1954, just days before the film premiered. I think this is all part of their promotion for the film, and we'll get more into that. On July 5th, Tanaka announced the production had begun. For Honda, when he hired his crew, he would have them read the script, and if they didn't believe in the project, he would have them leave. Quote, "This sense of terror was something the crew should never forget. That's how we had to do it. Not to look down on it as a genre film. I really wanted them to take it seriously." And the film would end up with about 30 crew members. In early designs of the monster, Tanaka expected a creature that was somewhere between a gorilla and a whale, because of the name. The designers of Gojira, which is Tezo Toshimitsu and Akira Watanabe, went more in the direction of making a creature look more like a dinosaur. So now this claim that Godzilla was ripping off the beast from 20,000 Fathoms Under the Sea seems less and less coincidental. Even though they tried not to be, Ray Harryhausen actually claimed that Godzilla was, quote, "a filch from the beast of 20,000 Fathoms." And he was quite bitter about that for a while.
I mean, giant dinosaurs just look cool.
Yeah, they do.
Also, I love how serious they are taking this whole thing and how they really want this to be about something and want this to mean something. And it's not really the tone I would have expected for a big monster movie.
Yeah. And that's kind of what everyone was expecting right away. It was like, oh, it's just a silly monster movie. How could you make this serious? And somehow they are doing exactly that.
Yeah.
There's another early design, which was done by Kazuyoshi Abe. That one was rejected. And in this, Gojira had more of a human type head and had a mushroom cloud type head.
I don't know if I like that.
Yeah, it was weird. Although not used for the film, Abe would use that design in the manga science adventure picture story Gojira, which got published before the film was released and closely follows the same story.
Huh.
The team used whatever dinosaur books that existed and an issue of Life magazine from September 1953 for inspiration. They combined elements of a Tyrannosaurus and a iguanodon to shape the creature, and then added dorsal fins very similar to a Stegosaurus. Tsuburaya was excited that he finally got to make a monster movie and could use stop motion techniques that he learned from Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen. With all the scenes storyboarded, he figured that it would take him about 7 years to make all the shots that contained Gojira. But Tanaka didn't have 7 years. He didn't even have 1 year. He told Tsuburaya that this film needed to be completed and released within this year, 1954, the year that they're already halfway through.
Wow.
Because they started in July.
Just I'm so excited to do this. I think it'll take about 7 years to make. That sound reasonable?
No. So instead, they settled on a technique that we now know of as suitmation.
I didn't realize there was a name for it.
Where an actor would have to wear a suit to embody the creature. The technique has been used before, like with the creature of the Black Lagoon, but this creature would have to somehow look like it was 160 feet tall. 3 different clay models were made of Gojira, with the winner being the design that we see in the 1954 movie. The suit was constructed by Kanju Yagi, Yasu Yagi, and Izo Kamai, who cleverly use wire and thin bamboo sticks to build the frame. Outside of that was a metal mesh that could hold coats of latex. Layers of molten rubber were added with strips of latex to create the texture of the creature's scales and scars. These scars were believed to be a reference to the Hibakusha, individuals who survived the nuclear blast. The suit ended up weighing about 220 pounds or 100 kilos. The eyes and the mouth were controlled by 3 wires that came out of the back of the suit, and the mouth was actually controlled by a bicycle brake handle whenever you squeezed it off screen. The tail was controlled with wires, and for close-ups, Toshimitsu made a smaller version of the head that could be operated like a puppet that could spray mist out of its mouth. The mist was originally known as an incandescent light, but now is known as Godzilla's atomic breath, a side effect of Gojira surviving the atomic blast. Haru Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka both performed in the Gojira suit. During the costume fitting, Nakajima fell down due to the weight and lack of flexibility. As a solution, and so they wouldn't have to toss out the suit, they actually cut the suit in half at the waist and used those for specific close-ups or medium close-ups. The bottom half was held up by suspenders. A second suit was made for full body shots. Even though it weighed less than the first suit, Nakajima could only wear the suit for about 3 minutes before he passed out.
Wow.
And Nakajima lost about 20 pounds during the production, but he still loved playing the role of Godzilla and continued to portray the monster until 1972 when he retired.
Wow.
Yeah. Nowadays, we can watch the film and laugh at some of the filming techniques and special effects. You can see the wrinkles in the rubber suit. The monster's unblinking bug eyes make the creature look more like a Muppet than a monster. Toy cars are used to crash into the rubble, and you can see the string that guide the bottle rockets fired from the model fighter jets. What I did find impressive was a blend of civilians running in the foreground while Gojira appeared in the background, all in the same shot. The shot we first see Gojira appear on screen was actually a composite shot using a double exposure technique.
Yeah.
The extras were shot first while part of the frame was blacked out, and then on the same reel, later reused, they superimposed the menacing Godzilla to appear behind them. For the majority of the screen that Gojira had, the creature would be placed in the middle of a miniature version of Ginza at a 1:25 scale. Put in charge of making the miniatures was Kintaro Mokino and about 40 other carpenters that took them nearly a month to construct.
Wow.
While scouting locations to map out the miniatures based on the real city, the crew was nearly arrested because a security guard had overheard their conversations on their plans to destroy the city and the area. They were soon released. They were soon released after showing the police officers their Toho business cards.
Wow. This makes me want to see a list of the most famous movie models of all time, because obviously like model making has been such a big part of like filmmaking and special effects.
Oh yeah.
I know Metropolis has like a crazy big city that was all done with a model. This has got to be one of the few times where the expansive model was meant to emulate a real city that already existed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no way we could see it now because they pretty much just burned the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see. And we still kind of see it now. Like we see it with Paul Thomas Anderson. He still loves using his miniatures. And I don't know if Tim Burton has gone back to his miniature days. I think after he did Sweeney Todd, he kind of moved away from doing miniatures. That was the first time that I really seen him use CGI to like do that sweeping shot over a city or like do an establishing shot that way. Nothing like he did with Edward Scissorhands or even literally in Beetlejuice.
Yeah, I always think about the miniatures used in Lord of the Rings, like that expansive Minas Tirith miniature that they created.
So Tsuburaya's wish partially came true when Gojira's tail had to destroy the Nishigeki theater, in which they had to use stop motion to achieve the effect. When filming the monster attacks, the film was shot at 72 frames per second, so that when played back at 24 frames per second, Gojira would have to move in a much more menacing way. For the glow of the beast's dorsal fins, the effect had to be drawn on film frame by frame. For the monster's massive footprints shot, the imprints were painted on a sheet of glass. It was filmed and then superimposed into live footage of a beach. When you watch the film, you'll see like there's this shot from the top of a mountain looking down at the beach. You can see it's a giant footprints followed by like a tail print that drags behind it.
Yeah.
The power line towers were made out of wax. So when they filmed it, the crew had to blow hot air and a beam of light on the towers to make them look like they were being melted by Gojira's atomic breath. The sound of Gojira's roar, or famously known as the screonk, that was created by the film's composer Akira Ifukube. At first, when he was trying to create the sound, he used sounds of a lion and tigers and birds.
Oh my.
It was a technique that was similarly done in King Kong when they made his roar, but they tried playing it back, they tried messing with it, and it just was not working. So Ifukube, he instead used a rubber glove soaked in pine tar, and then he rubbed it against a contrabass.
Wow.
Which is basically just an upright bass.
I love weird sound effect stories so much.
Yeah. He loosened the strings on it, and then he played the recording back at a reduced speed to give it that low rumble to it. And that's why we get
cool.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Ifukube's serious tone score was another factor that helped sell the film. Ifukube, he worked on a theme to play over any military scenes, but Honda thought it would work best when you see Gojira on screen, and inadvertently had become Godzilla's theme song from then on. Ifukube, I think he was drinking buddies with Tsuburaya. I believe that they were drinking buddies like when Tsuburaya was like blacklisted, and he actually asked to borrow money from him, and then years later they started working on the same movie, and they're like, oh, you're the guy I used to drink with. It's crazy.
That's awesome.
So Honda, the director, wanted to get footage of the Japan Self-Defense Forces and capture shots of real soldiers performing drills and conducting target practice. The JSDF wasn't very cooperative with Honda and his crew with getting footage that they needed, but they did provide him with stock footage shot during World War II that he actually inserted into the film. The production took 122 days to film with a budget of about 100 million yen, or about $275,000, which was one of the most expensive films that Toho had made. This was the same year that Seven Samurai was made, and the budget for that was nearly double Gojira's.
Wow.
So those two movies alone nearly bankrupted Toho.
I'm guessing they were big bets that paid off, though.
Oh yeah, definitely. I don't want to get too much into the plot just because the movie is out there and you can watch it, but I do want to point out some of the plot points that were relevant to the historical context.
Yeah.
In the first scene, the Japanese freighter Ikumaru is attacked by an unseen Gojira. The key shot is the bright flash that hits the crew, implying that they got hit with the atomic breath. Clearly a reference to the Lucky Dragon number 5. Mm-hmm. The atomic breath is acting like an atomic explosion, but the film makes it clear that the people are suffering from its effects, even though it didn't hit them directly. Masaji, the character found on the raft, would embody the Niju Hibakusha, individuals that survived both atomic attacks. Shinkichi is left an orphan after the first attack on Odu, much like how the atomic attacks killed many of the survivors' family members. There's Serizawa's research and the oxygen destroyer, in which he states that this device and his research cannot get in the hands of leaders and politicians, for they will use it as a weapon. This is clearly a jab to the US, especially Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer and their nuclear research that led to the atomic bombs. Both were trying to create something to help the world and created something that could destroy it.
Yeah.
Gojira doesn't just come into existence or is discovered, much like other monster movies. Instead, the beast is released from an underground habitat after an H-bomb test and surfaces to exact its revenge.
Have you ever seen the Bong Joon-ho movie, The Host?
Oh, no, I haven't.
It's a monster movie with like similar kind of origin. I think that even specifically starts with American scientists doing some sort of crazy experimentation that creates this monster that gets released on Korea. It's very much from the same place of American meddling causes this destruction in Asia.
Huh. I'll have to check that out. Lastly, in the not-so-subtle monologue after the monster is killed, Dr. Yamane states, quote, "If nuclear testing continues, then someday, somewhere in the world, another Gojira may appear." Which is a great setup for a sequel and a lesson for nations with nuclear power. Now, it would have been really easy to have made this into a silly monster movie, but Honda made sure that they thought out a lot of the decisions to avoid that stigma. The most important one, in my mind, is the casting of Takashi Shimura as the scientist Dr. Yamane. The scientist was going to originally portray a mad scientist, but Honda wanted the scientist to be taken seriously because he thought highly of scientists and thought of them as heroes. The character makes you feel for the monster, showing that it is just an animal that wants to survive, and takes the noble approach to study the animal and how it resists atomic attacks, and that maybe they could use that ability to defend themselves. As for the Japanese military, they were looking for a way to destroy the animal. Shimura was a familiar name in Japanese cinema, having been in about 200 films before this one.
Ooh, wow.
But most notably, he was the lead actor in Drunken Angel, Rashomon, Akira, and Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
This character would set the tone for the film and would give the franchise its longevity.
Wow.
Yeah. When this film was released in Japan on November 3rd, droves of people went to the theater to see this film. It was reported that the Nishikeki Theater had a line of people wrapped around the building 3 times just to get tickets for the film.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. The marketing for the film was brilliant because from July 17th to September 25th, Toho released a radio show called Kaiju Gojira that used the script's first draft and then broke it up to serialize the show. The public's curiosity of what the creature looked like is what motivated them to go to the theaters.
That's very cool. You know, Jaws don't show the shark idea.
Yeah. I mean, this on top of releasing the manga, releasing the novelization of the movie, like it was just everywhere and everyone was just curious about like this awesome movie.
I have a question for you. The radio series that had the word kaiju in its title, do you happen to know the origins of kaiju? Because that I know is always a word associated with big monsters like Godzilla, but I kind of feel like that genre started with Godzilla.
I don't fully know the origins of kaiju. I know that somewhere in the research, someone had mentioned that kaiju is Japanese for strange creature. I didn't actually look too far into it.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It looks like the word originally referred to monsters and creatures from ancient Japanese legends. It was a word that exists before, but it looks like through this genre of monster movies became associated with, specifically with Godzilla-type monsters, where Godzilla or Gojira is referred to as the first kaiju film.
Huh, I didn't know that.
You know what? The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms that you were talking about.
Yeah.
When it was released in Japan, the title was translated to Genshi Kaiju Arawaru.
Oh.
Which literally means an atomic kaiju appears.
Whoa.
So the word referring to monster movies actually came from the Japanese translation of an American movie.
Interesting.
Huh, that's really cool.
Also in the promotion of this film, they did advertise that the special effects were better than what Hollywood was coming out with, which is Debatable.
They came up with a lot of cool techniques for this.
They did.
Even under the time constraints, and even if some of it looks a little worse by today's standards.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like the idea that when you're working under constraints, that's where some, really ingenious creativity can come from.
Yeah.
They were able to pioneer a lot of amazing special effects methods through the constraints of this movie.
It did. Yeah, I'll agree with that. The movie afterwards, it was nominated for 2 Japanese Movie Association Awards. It was nominated for Best Film and Best Special Effects. They ended up winning Best Special Effects, but they lost to Best Film to Seven Samurai.
Seven Samurai is a pretty good film.
Yeah. Honda's career would forever be defined by Godzilla, but it was the humanity that he inserted into the film that proved that he was a great filmmaker. For Tsuburaya, he started his own production company in 1963 and created another legendary character, UltraMan.
UltraMan, UltraMan, here he comes from the sky.
So, how did Gojira make its way into the US? The fact that it was even considered is baffling because so many factors were working against it. This is around the time of the Cold War. 2 of the high-level crew members were labeled as war criminals. The director is a pacifist. The theme is about the negative effects of hydrogen bomb tests. And one of the main characters sacrifices himself to destroy the beast, which is paralleling to the kamikaze fighters during World War II, and especially during the attacks on Pearl Harbor. So when Toho decided to begin distributing the film internationally, this is when they changed the name from Gojira to Godzilla. The reason for the change isn't really well known, but from my understanding, they changed it so that it was easier to pronounce and easier to spell for an English-speaking audience.
It also sounds like Godzilla, and Zilla, I think, gets commonly associated with lizard, that it's a giant god-sized lizard. It really reminds me of the way that all the Pokemon are renamed in the States to be combinations of English language words. The name Bulbasaur doesn't have the same meaning in Japan because it's a combination of bulb and dinosaur. The name Ekans does not have a meaning in Japan. That's English snake backwards. And so It's interesting how these Japanese names are translated in America.
I didn't know that about Pokemon.
Yeah.
Also, the backwards snake thing, also had no idea.
You had no idea that Ekans was snake backwards?
I never really looked in or thought much of it.
Oh, do you know about the legendary birds?
No.
There's Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres. Articuno is Articuno, and then the second one is Zapdos, and the third one is Moltres.
That's pretty clever. American producer Joseph E. Levine bought the rights for Godzilla from Toho for $25,000 with the agreement that he could edit the film before releasing it in the US. The film was retitled to Godzilla, King of the Monsters, and the runtime was trimmed from 96 minutes to 80 minutes. Most of the Japanese dialogue was dubbed into English, and entirely new shots and scenes were added to the film with Canadian actor Raymond Burr portraying Steve Martin.
My name is Steve Martin. I'm a foreign correspondent for United World News. I was headed for an assignment in Cairo when I stopped off in Tokyo for a social call. But it turned out to be a visit to the living hell of another world.
Right away, the first shot shows the destruction left behind by Godzilla, where we meet Steve injured in the rubble, in a "you're probably wondering how I got here" type of opening scene. In shots where Steve has to interact with main characters, you can clearly tell that it's a double with their back to the camera, cut to footage of the character talking, but dubbed over to respond appropriately. The dubbing of the film was done in about 5 hours, and the actors weren't able to view any of the footage from the original movie.
Wow.
Yeah. Instead, they were told to simply read off of a script. This is how we get the comically dubbed in lines that don't match the movements of the actors' mouths at all.
Yep.
There is no mention of nuclear tests, although there are some images that imply it, like when a child is being tested for radiation poisoning. But if you don't know what that device is, you have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, interesting.
When we first see Dr. Yamane, he doesn't mention that they should study the creature, but simply states that the creature could be found on Odu Island. Steve is spliced into many other scenes, like the hurricane scene, the government meetings, the Odu Island attack when we first see Godzilla, and the main Godzilla city-wide destruction. For some reason, the monster is claimed to be 400 feet tall and not the original 160 feet. No one really knows why they said that.
I mean, if they were reading it in the span of 5 hours, maybe the script still said 160 feet.
Maybe.
And just, the actor messed up and they just kept on going.
Yeah, it's like, we only have you guys for 5 hours. We've got to keep going, keep rolling. Dr. Yamane does state that Godzilla was a product of H-bomb testing, which I'm surprised they actually put into the film. But this is really the only mention of nuclear weapons, which I'm guessing from, if you can make that origin for 20,000 Fathoms, I think you can do it for this as well. So I figure, like, we've done in the US, we can kind of mention it, but we're not going to like dwell on it and say like it's wrong. We're just going to say it's a product of the bombing testing, and that's it. Mm-hmm. When Godzilla attacks Tokyo, Steve is placed in a building to report on what he sees, providing a voiceover commentary during the attack until the building he's stationed in is destroyed. And we're back where the movie began. Mm-hmm. Akimo tells Steve about the oxygen destroyer instead of revealing the secret to Ogata. Godzilla is destroyed with the ending message being Shirazawa sacrificing himself so that Okimo and Ogata could be together. Any mention of nuclear weapon testing and the destruction of mankind and the mention of another Godzilla emerging is cut out completely. The added shots took about 3 days to shoot, and they had Raymond Burr do a 24-hour shift to get all of his shots done.
Wow.
After the film was re-edited, it was released in theaters on April 27th, 1956. During its run in US theaters, the American version ended up making more money than the original Japanese film.
Wow.
Honda was completely unaware that his film was drastically re-edited until the American version was sent back to Toho Studios and premiered in Japan under the title Monster King Godzilla in May of 1957. The dubbed Japanese actors were subtitled since the script had been so drastically changed.
Yeah.
The frame was also cropped to make the film appear to be a 2.35 by 1 wide aspect ratio.
Oh, interesting.
So this made the film look awkwardly framed. The original Japanese 1954 version of the film wouldn't be seen by Americans until 2004 when it was re-released in select theaters. There's a conflicting mentality about the heavily re-edited version of the film. Yes, it completely deflated the themes that Honda was portraying in the film, but without this version of the film, it may not have been seen internationally, or it may not have been internationally released, and it probably wouldn't have the fandom nor the notoriety that it has today, and probably wouldn't be the longest running franchise.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I kind of think of it like when a band sells out, or not really sells out, but like they sell their music to be used in commercials. Like if it wasn't for the Honda CR-V, would anyone really know who the Black Keys are?
Fair enough.
If the American version wasn't enough to handle, there is also an Italian cut of the film, which is known as Godzilla or Godzilla, named after the filmmaker Luigi Cozzi. This film was released 20 years later in 1977. It was a colorized version of Godzilla King of the Monsters, not Gojira, the American version, Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now, colorized is a term very loosely used because if you watch the footage, it looks like someone had just take various colors of highlighters and just started like coloring in the film.
Yeah, I've seen some stuff like that before.
Yeah, it's pretty messed up. Instead of cutting the runtime, he actually did the opposite and added more footage to the film to make it 1 hour and 45 minutes long.
What?
So part of it is that the cinemas that are in Italy, it won't be played in theaters unless it's over 90 minutes long.
Oh,
so the American version was cut down to 80 minutes, but then they had to add some footage, and he just kind of went overboard with it.
Why would Italy have that rule? That's interesting.
I don't know.
Because like you'd think it's in the theater's best interest for shorter films because then you could play more in a day and get more ticket sales.
Yeah, maybe it's more of like a quality control thing. Like,
yeah, maybe
if you're able to make a movie that's 90 minutes long, then you've clearly put some time and effort into this.
Yeah,
maybe. I'm not sure what the actual rule is. That's just my speculation. But yeah, instead of steering away from any mentions of nuclear attacks, Cozy steers into the skid and takes a full head-on collision by adding scenes and real footage of wreckage from nuclear attacks, including shots of actual dead bodies.
Whoa, that's a little hardcore.
This is messed up.
Yeah, I don't think that's ethical filmmaking.
No, it is not. During the attack scenes, the screen seems to flash red like a strobe light and added actual war footage to splice into it to add the violence.
Ooh.
Footage of actual refugees are added into the film. There's footage of real fighter jets are actually added into this, although none of them match each other, not just the country of origin, but like the time that it was shot. So like they could be from all over the place. So from World War II, from any era, really.
Yeah.
They're just like, it looks cool, let's put it into the movie. There's even footage of an actual atomic bomb exploding. When we go underwater, there is a shot of a real shark and an octopus fighting each other that goes on for way too long.
What?
I don't know why.
Wow.
When Godzilla is dying, we see battleships firing off their cannons. At the end of the movie, we see a title card that reads, "It's the end," or is it? And then the credits roll over top of more footage of explosions. And then at the very end of that, we get another title card that says Finn with a question mark.
Oh my gosh. You gotta calm down, Luigi.
It's a lot. What I would like to go over next is kind of an overview of the eras of Godzilla,
Sure.
which correspond with the Japanese emperor during the production, as well as the evolution of Godzilla and the changes made to the character in each film, and include some of the monsters that it had to fight. So there's the Showa era, the Heisei era, the Millennium era, and the Reiwa era. The Millennium era happened during the time Heisei was still emperor, but the style and the storyline changed so drastically during this time that it needed to be recognized. Each of the eras tend to reflect the social and political climate of Japan at that time. So the first one that we have is the Showa era from 1954 to 1975. Many of the initial themes we had covered in the origins of the original 1954 film, the effects of the atomic bomb and the consequences of using and testing these weapons. Hiro Nakajima, we mentioned before, was the man inside the suit for the majority of this era up until 1972, but there are many other stuntmen to embody the beast when some of these stunts were too physically demanding for him. Ashiro Honda did not come back for the sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, but he did return for King Kong vs. Godzilla and ended up directing 7 out of the 15 movies in the Showa era.
Wow.
Yeah. Terror of Mechagodzilla, the final movie in the Showa era, was the last Godzilla movie he would ever direct. Tsuburaya was the effects director for the first 6 Godzilla movie until his protege, Sadamasa Irakawa, took over for the next 3 movies under the supervision of Tsuburaya. Honda would be credited as both the director and the special effects director for All Monsters Attack, and Teriyushu Nakano took over as the effects director for the final 6 movies of the Showa era and the first film of the Heisei era, The Return of Godzilla. For Godzilla's look, in the second film, Godzilla Raids Again, which is supposed to be a different Godzilla, but the same species. The creature seems skinnier, has longer arms, smaller head. Without really looking into this, it seems like they wanted a more agile costume compared to the first film. This is the first time we see Godzilla go toe-to-toe or claw-to-claw with another kaiju, the Ingrais. This would be the first list of monsters Godzilla would have to battle. In King Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962, for the very first time, we get to see both King Kong and Godzilla in Technicolor and anamorphic widescreen. Although Tsuburaya fulfilled his dream of working on a King Kong film, it was all done in suitmation. Although the Godzilla really didn't take advantage of the color film, seeing that it was mostly gray with a hint of green, the movie posters would emphasize that the monster is really green and try to sell the film as being in color. Although they did make his eyes yellow, But then in Mothra versus Godzilla in 1964, he does lose that yellow eye color for white eyes.
When I think of Godzilla now, I think of a green monster initially, but I know movie posters of original Godzilla is that gray Godzilla.
Yeah.
Whereas posters at the time aren't necessarily in black and white, but because this is a black and white movie, depicting Godzilla as gray. I almost wonder if this Technicolor movie just started to go greenish because they were like, well, we don't want it to look too different from the version of Godzilla people know, both from the movie, but also from all the advertising and stuff. So we'll start to go that green a little bit.
If you see the movie posters, like it really pops. But then when you watch the actual movie, you're just like, I guess he's kind of green. I don't know.
Yeah.
With Mothra versus Godzilla, in this we get Mothra, which you can probably guess what type of creature this kaiju is modeled off of.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time we get an instance of a shape-shifting kaiju, because it starts off as a big larvae. In Ghidorah, the three-headed monster in 1964, Godzilla is now tasked with defending the people from monsters rather than being the attacker. This is the first time we see Godzilla as a good guy, a complex anti-hero. Ghidorah would be a major foe to Godzilla and would later be known as King Ghidorah. This is the first film that we are also introduced to Rodan, a pterodon-like kaiju. In fact, the name Rodan is a contraction of the word pteranodon. An invasion of Astro-Monster in 1965. No new monsters are introduced unless you want to consider the Zalians monsters. Rodan and Godzilla team up to fight Ghidorah. In this, Godzilla gets to show off his ability and unforgettable victory dance. This is actually really cool. If you actually look up the Godzilla victory dance, it's so weird because he like jumps up into the air and does like this weird jig. It's pretty famous.
I'm curious about all of the different other monsters coming in and making this into a franchise and everything. Are they still thinking about some of the themes that they were really serious with in the first movie? Or at this point, are they just like, you know what, big monsters are fun and cool, and we're just going to do that and not really think about the bigger implications?
They start steering into the skid of Godzilla versus other big monster. Mm-hmm. And the way that I think about it is like with Fast and Furious and the evolution of that movie.
Yes.
And to think that it all started off with just street racers.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden this franchise has turned into like, they are international spies. They are assassins for hire or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it just like gets blown out of proportion. And you're just thinking like, wait a minute. So these films came out of a movie that's simply about street racing. And this is kind of where Godzilla starts to deviate. It's like, oh, it's an allegory for atomic bombs and weapons and testing and like the horrors behind that. I think the better, more modern understanding of this is Jurassic Park, where the first Jurassic Park is all about do not mess with nature because nature will kill you. And we have not learned anything from that. And in fact, we have this going on with Jurassic World right now, where they're still continuing to mess with nature. And you thought, like, didn't we learn this lesson in the first movie? But the thing is that people just want to see dinosaurs. And that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, dinosaurs are pretty cool.
I mentioned the Zalians. They actually started to control the kaijus through mind control. It's weird. It's bizarre. And Akira, Horror of the Deep in 1966, when in other theaters, or at least in the US, it was called Godzilla versus the Sea Monster.
Okay.
I noticed that a lot of these movies were like renamed when they were brought to different countries.
Yeah.
I thought that would just take too long, but I will acknowledge that, yes, all of these films, if not most of these films, do have a name change when it comes to the US, when it's distributed in other countries. And that's true for most movies that are distributed internationally. So this movie, Akira, Horror of the Deep, was supposed to be a King Kong movie, in which King Kong was then replaced with Godzilla instead, and they took that storyline. Godzilla fights a giant crustacean known as Akira and a large bird known as giant condor. Next is Son of Godzilla in 1967, in which you could probably guess Godzilla is raising a child named Manila, who oddly resembles the baby from Dinosaurs, or should I say that the baby from Dinosaurs looks a lot like Godzilla's offspring, because that wouldn't premiere until 24 years later.
Huh. Is that a thing that people think is like the direct inspiration?
This was my own conclusion.
Okay.
I didn't see other theories out there, but when I saw the monster, I don't know if you can look it up.
Yeah, wow. It really does look like the baby from Dinosaurs.
Right? So the theme of this movie seems to be bugs, because Godzilla and Manila face off against the Kamacuras, which is a giant praying mantis, and Komonga, which is a giant spider. In Destroy All Monsters in 1968, it is just a battle royale of kaijus. Returning is King Ghidorah, Rodan, Mothra, Anguirus, Manila, and Komonga. And introduced us to Manda, which is a sea dragon. There is the Gorosaurus, which looks like a T-Rex. There's the Baragon, which is a reptilian with a horn for a nose and has big ears. And the Varan, which is a flying squirrel reptile.
Awesome.
It's pretty great. It's like Gremlins 2, where they think, what would be a fun gremlin to see? And that's what they do, is they're like, what's a fun kaiju to see? A creature, a bug, an animal that you just want to see big. And that's essentially how they come up with kaijus. And it's pretty great.
Love it.
In All Monsters Attack in 1969, it is all about Manila standing up to his bully, Gabara, which, spoiler alert, is a dream that a little boy has and acts like a metaphor so that he can stand up to a bully at school. This movie really solidified that these monster movies were aiming for a youthful audience and not really anything else. The titles of the next 4 movies were not so subtle. This is where we started getting the Godzilla versus insert monster here. Mm-hmm. In Godzilla vs. Hedorah in 1971, Godzilla fights pollution metaphorically and literally. He obtains the ability to fly when curled up and uses his atomic breath as a thruster.
Okay.
If you look up the monster for it, Hedorah, it's more of like a kind of like a smog monster with a bunch of tentacles. It's weird.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. In Godzilla vs. Gigan, who's an alien cyborg, Godzilla is given the ability to talk.
Something funny going on. You better check.
And is given zippers. In fact, in this movie's notorious. There's a part where Godzilla puts up his arms and you can see all the zippers underneath his arm.
Oh.
In Godzilla versus Megalon, we're introduced to Jet Jaguar, who bears a suspicious resemblance to UltraMan, and Megalon, another insectoid kaiju, although it seems like it's a combination of multiple bugs compiled onto a humanoid body. In this movie, Godzilla has the ability to super dropkick, where he kind of turns sideways and just flies across the screen into a deadly dropkick. In Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 1974, we are introduced to King Caesar, an ancient Shiza-like kaiju. But in this film, with one of my personal favorite kaijus, Mechagodzilla, an alien mecha has disguised itself first as Godzilla and then turns into Mechagodzilla. And then lastly, we have Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975, where Godzilla faces off with a mind-controlled Titanosaurus, an aquatic dinosaur kaiju, and a rebuilt Mechagodzilla. Godzilla then returns to the sea, and his job is done, or is it? Because this is the end of the very first era, the Showa era.
Okay.
Even though Godzilla films had stopped in 1975, its influence can be seen throughout. Steven Spielberg has been a fan of the monster movies, and that terrorizing feeling, you can sense that feeling in Jaws, especially. And then, obviously, with the Jurassic Park movies. And then, in Ready Player One, there is a cameo of Mechagodzilla. Mm-hmm. We mentioned before the Blue Oyster Cult with their 1977 hit. Paleontologists around this time had discovered a new dinosaur, and in honor of Godzilla, they actually named this dinosaur Gojirasaurus.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. Hanna-Barbera and Toho Studios actually teamed up to make a Godzilla animated series.
Up from the depths, 30 stories high, breathing fire, his head in the sky. Godzilla, 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 and Godzilla.
Because of censors, Godzilla couldn't kill people, demolish buildings, or crush vehicles. Their version spit fire and had laser beams that shot from its eyes, much like Superman. Other countries tried making their own form of Godzilla, like in Denmark with Reptilius, Gorgo in Britain, South Korea's Yangari, and even North Korea had their own reptilian kaiju named Pulgasari. In 1977 to 1979, Marvel Comics came out with a 24-issue run known as Godzilla King of the Monsters. The series was written by Doug Moach and drawn by Herb Trimpe. Toho Studios granted Marvel Comics the rights to use Godzilla. The only problem is that it was only Godzilla. His famous friends and foes like Mothra, Ghidorah, Rodan, and Mechagodzilla were not part of the package.
Interesting.
Well, luckily for Marvel, they have plenty of other characters to face off against the Atomic Beast. In the series, Godzilla emerges from a glacier near Alaska and eventually ends up in New York City.
It's a long trek.
It is. Godzilla acts more like a highly intelligent creature set on destruction as opposed to being a defender of humanity. Godzilla faces off against the agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the Champions, although that excludes Ghost Rider and Darkstar, the Fantastic Four, Devil Dinosaur and Moon Boy, the Avengers, and there's a special appearance from Spider-Man.
Awesome.
The thing is, though, is that when you watch Godzilla, the reason why you watch him is so that you can watch him fight other monsters.
Yeah.
So Marvel had to deliver. Godzilla fought against the new additions, the Batragon, the Gilaron, the Leprechauns, and Centaur, monsters created by Dr. Demonicus. There was Yetigar, the giant Bigfoot, the alien beasts Rion and Krolar, and Red Ronin, a giant mecha samurai robot. If you would like to read this, Marvel in 2006 reprinted the issue as an anthology known as The Essential Godzilla King of the Monsters, all printed in black and white as an homage to the first Godzilla films, as opposed to the original color print from the 70s.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I actually did look it up to see how much it was. The first listing was like $150 on Amazon, but if you start searching around, like if you go on eBay, you can start finding them for cheaper prices. I think the cheapest I found was like $50, $60 for it, which for a 24-issue run, that's a pretty decent deal.
Yeah, yeah.
So now there is the Heisei era from 1984 to 1995. With a move that we've seen with the Halloween and Jurassic Park franchises, The Return of Godzilla acts as a direct sequel to the original film and ignores the events that happens in the sequels. Even though the film was released during the Showa era, it's just easier to lump this film in the Heisei era because most of the preceding films took place during that reign. Mm-hmm. The Return of Godzilla was released in 1984, 9 years after Terror of Mechagodzilla. Toho Studios had been looking for a way to reboot Godzilla since 1977. Their first idea was to make the original Godzilla, but in Technicolor, and call it The Rebirth of Godzilla. A year later, they teamed up with UPA Studios to try and develop Godzilla vs. the Devil.
Nice.
And they worked with producer Henry G. Saperstein of the United Productions of America to develop Godzilla vs. Gargantua.
Huh. This is so dumb, but when I was in film school, we did a murder mystery dinner party once, and it was supposed to be old Hollywood themed. One of the people was supposed to be old time movie producer, director or something, and he would just be going around to people and just being like, have you heard about my new picture? He just would throw out random things all the time, but my favorite that was have you heard about my new picture? Godzilla versus cancer.
That's great. That's basically what it came down to. What's your Godzilla ideas? Basically coming up with a new villain for him to go after.
Yep.
Both ideas were eventually shelved. For producer Tanaka, who originally started Godzilla, he was looking to send Godzilla back to the dark anti-nuclear roots and bring back the adult audience the film was originally intended for, especially after the wake of the 3 Mile Island incident, where a nuclear power plant in Londonderry Township, Pennsylvania, experienced a meltdown. Akira Maru was hired to write a new story, which he titled The Resurrection of Godzilla, that he submitted in 1980. In the story, we become aware of an illegal nuclear waste disposal site. Godzilla would face off against a shape-shifting monster called Gigan that would morph from a monkey beast into a water beast, and lastly, a dragon beast. And Godzilla would be portrayed as a villain from then on after absorbing the energy from the nuclear power plant. The project was initially canceled because the budget was just way too high. Steve Miner, who directed Friday the 13th Part 2 and 3, asked to direct the film at his own expense, and Toho agreed because it's just money that they don't have to spend. Fred Decker, who wrote The Monster Squad and RoboCop 3, he was hired to write a draft of the film. In it, there's a baby Godzilla that's killed, and the parent goes on a rampage. Elements of the Cold War was added, and a flying fortress, which is called Super X, fires cadmium missiles into Godzilla's mouth. Godzilla was designed to look more like a T-Rex. Miner was hoping to create Godzilla using stop motion and wanted to shoot in 3D. But those decisions took the budget and ballooned it up, and every studio would not agree to foot the bill for this film. And that film was also then canceled. There was also an American spoof film that was in development in the early 80s called It Ate Cleveland, or Godzilla vs. Cleveland. They tried to use Godzilla without Toho's permission, but they soon got shut down by Toho's lawyers. Toho not only had to worry about other studios trying to make Godzilla without their permission, but also former employees of Toho as well. Most of the unapproved Godzilla vs. the Wolfman was filmed, according to Shazu Nakajima, before it was shut down. So every idea seemed to be failing, so Tanaka came up with the idea that he could retcon the franchise while still remaining true to the material, and thought up the idea that they should make a direct sequel to the 1954 film. Elements taken from the recently canceled Resurrection of Godzilla as well.
There's a lot of Lego sequels now. Didn't the new Halloween be like, yeah, this is only a sequel to like Halloween 2 or something, and the rest of those aren't real.
Yeah, because Jamie Lee Curtis dies in the 4th one, I believe. So when everyone saw the sequel and she was in it, they're like, the hell's going on, man? They wanted to make a direct sequel to the 1954 film. They disregarded all the other films in the franchise. Sushi Nagahari was hired to write a draft, and then he used elements from the canceled Resurrection of Godzilla. In it, Gigan has given a 4th form, a demon beast. So finally we get Godzilla versus the devil. But Tanaka wanted to hire Ishiro Honda to direct the sequel, but he declined and expressed that the franchise should not continue, especially after the death of Eiji Tsuburaya. They attempted to bring back some of the original actors, like Takashi Shimura, but he unfortunately passed away in 1982, and Akihiro Hirata, but he passed away as well in 1984. Regardless, they pushed on and hired director Kojo Hashimoto to make the sequel. Gigan was going to be too expensive to make in all 4 forms and was removed from the film. Gigan has entered into the lore of Godzilla through other drafts, mangas, and the video game Super Godzilla, but has yet to make a theatrical appearance. Terayushi Nakano was hired as the special effects director. In this reboot, Godzilla was made to look taller, from 50 meters to 80 meters, or 100 feet taller than the original 160 feet, because in this day and age, skyscrapers and buildings were much taller and would dwarf Godzilla by comparison in its previous height.
Yeah, makes sense.
Nakano took inspiration from the Dino De Laurentiis King Kong and made a 16-foot tall robotic Godzilla known as Cybot. The Cybot is hydraulically powered and remote controlled. It was primarily used for close-ups and gave off facial feature movements that no longer felt puppet-like. It wasn't used very much in the film, but it was utilized while promoting the movie. Nobuyuki Yashimaru designed the new and improved Godzilla, giving him more dorsal fins, giving back his 4 toes, ears, and fangs, and made the beast look more terrifying, and no longer a friendly dinosaur. This suit has never been seen after filming because it was stolen and no one found out where it ended up.
Wow.
Which is quite the task because the suit ended up being 110 kilograms or 240 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an interesting heist story.
Yeah, that's insane. For as much effort that was put into the movie, the one thing that they failed to mention was how Godzilla came back. Because in the first movie, he was disintegrated. And the first sequel mentions that it's a new Godzilla. And in this, he just is. He's just Godzilla. He just appears. At the end of the movie, Godzilla steps into a volcano at the end, which gave a new tone to the franchise. Director Hishimoto stated, quote, "I wanted viewers to feel sorry for Godzilla. The existence of Godzilla itself is a dilemma. Godzilla is a living conflict of evil and sadness." I thought that was an interesting approach to this reboot. Yeah. The film was released December 15th, 1984 in Japan with much success, and another sequel was pretty much guaranteed. The movie would be released in the US under the distribution company New World Pictures, and like Godzilla King of the Monsters in 1956, the film was heavily altered for American audiences and retitled Godzilla 1985. Now, you'd think that the film industry would learn from their mistakes and not forcibly insert an American character in a predominantly Japanese story. But like the 1980 remake of Jazz Singer in blackface, they did not learn their lesson. Raymond Burr would reprise his role as Steve Martin. But because of the famous banjo player, they simply addressed him as Mr. Martin. Before Burr, they considered hiring Leslie Nielsen and wanted to re-edit the film to be more of a spoof.
Very like Kung Pao.
Yeah, and you have to consider the time that it came out in 1985. Like, Naked Gun movies are coming out. You had Airplane. You had, a bunch of these spoof movies. It was probably best to bring on Burr because he was adamant that this film had to be taken seriously. And if there was any comedy in it, he was out. This time, he wasn't in, well, quote, Japan. In fact, when they shot his scenes for Godzilla King of the Monsters, it was actually just a studio here in Burbank that they shot it all in. He never went to Japan at all. In this, all of his scenes take place in the Pentagon. In the American version, they cut out shots and effects that look cheap, like bad miniatures. They also needed the film to be shorter and have Godzilla arrive earlier. The biggest and most notable change is the nuclear tension between the Soviets and the US. They were looked upon as moral equals. So instead, they edited the film to look like the Soviets fired a nuclear missile at Japan on purpose and not accidentally, like in the original.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It sounds like originally it's kind of commenting on like, hey, you guys are doing the thing that we said is bad, which is building a whole bunch more nuclear weapons. Don't do this. You're both at fault.
But instead, when it comes to the US, it's like, oh no, we're not at fault here. It's Russia who's doing the bad things.
Oof. Oh boy.
So Mr. Martin does provide a final monologue when Godzilla enters into the volcano or jumps into the volcano. That monologue was written by Raymond Burr. It wasn't written by anyone else or the director. It was a speech that was similar to what Dr. Yamane told us at the end of the 1954 Godzilla, saying like, we need to learn our lesson from this.
The reckless ambitions of man are often dwarfed by their dangerous consequences. For now, Godzilla, that strangely innocent and tragic monster, has gone to Earth.
I have a lot of respect for Raymond Burr for doing this because you can tell in the first one, he's just going through the motions, given he's there for a day and he's like, this isn't going to come to anything. To realize what Godzilla is actually about and for him to return to be like,
no, I want to actually make sure this means something.
Yeah, if the Japanese are going to take this seriously, I need to take this seriously.
Yeah.
And in doing so, the American filmmakers need to take this seriously too.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect that. That's great.
Yeah. Godzilla erupts back with Godzilla versus Biollante in 1989. In this, Godzilla is given a second row of teeth in his mouth. Like the era before, we fall right back into naming the movies as Godzilla versus insert monster here. In this film, we are introduced to a new monster, Biollante, a genetically modified rose kaiju, like if Audrey 2 from Little Shop of Horrors became a kaiju and then burst into glitter in a portrait of a little girl. Next was going to be a remake of King Kong vs. Godzilla, but obtaining the rights proved to be too expensive, so instead Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was made in 1991. For the first time, we get time travel in a Godzilla movie.
Nice.
I had to look into this just to see what this was all about. So here's a little synopsis. A team goes back to 1940, back when Godzilla was just a simple Gojirasaurus, to send him into the ocean to avoid nuclear tests, and he doesn't become Godzilla. Instead, the Futurans plant 3 baby Dorats on an island, and after a nuclear test, they mutate into King Ghidorah, and the kaiju now terrorizes Japan instead of Godzilla. Gojirasaurus is radiated inevitably by another bomb test and is turned into Godzilla, and then that Godzilla is then brought in to fight off Ghidorah. Godzilla is even bigger now, being about 100 meters or 330 feet tall. Godzilla defeats Ghidorah, but now Godzilla is on a rampage. Now the time travelers have to retrieve Ghidorah's corpse from the future. They build a robot suit around it, making Mecha King Godzilla to defeat Godzilla.
Okay.
That's the most detail I'm going to get into these sequels, but I heard about this film and I was like, what?
Every franchise, if it runs long enough, will eventually go to time travel.
Yeah. I'm still waiting for Fast and the Furious to do time travel. You know they're going to do it.
It's going to happen.
They've been to space. They have to do time travel.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Godzilla vs. Mothra in 1992, the yellow eyes are back. Mothra is now accompanied by Batra, a dark divine Mothra kaiju. In Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, done in 1993, this is not a sequel to the 1974 Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. We do get a return of everyone's favorite Mechagodzilla, who is now Super Mechagodzilla, and everyone's least favorite Baby Godzilla, who is different from Manila because it's blue, I guess. We also get a return of Rodan, but as Fire Rodan. In Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla in 1995, Space Godzilla is known as an evil clone. We are introduced to the Mobile Operation Godzilla Universal Expert Robot Aerotype, or Megora, a mech constructed by the UN from leftover Mechagodzilla parts. Baby Godzilla has grown, but not by much, and is known still as Little Godzilla. In the final film of the Heisei era, we have Godzilla vs. Destroya in 1995, which didn't feel much like a final film because the OG Godzilla, who is now glowing orange, he dies and its powers gets passed on to its son, who is implied to be the next Godzilla to follow in his dad's thunderous footsteps. The battle against a crustacean kaiju known as Destroya, which looks like a cross between Godzilla and a dragon, is defeated in that film. So this is kind of where I'm going to end the history of it.
Okay. I mean, we covered a lot. We even covered a lot of movies that weren't made.
Yeah. And I also wanted to mention that, yes, there are many unmade Godzilla movies that are out there. And for the sake of the show and for the bandwidth of the deep dive, we can only really go into one. Mm-hmm. This is a subject that most likely I'm going to revisit in the future to allow myself more time and understanding into this, fascinating subject, and go into a deeper dive into areas that I may have missed or skimmed over, because I definitely missed a lot. Mm-hmm. I want to acknowledge that there is the Millennium Era, which spans from 1994 to 2004, and the Rira Era, which we are currently in. And they actually switched over to animated feature movies, which is actually really neat.
Yeah.
I wanted to focus primarily on the origins of Godzilla so that we may better understand the trajectory of where it went and the shortcomings to those who misinterpreted the creature and the message. With that said, the film that we are going to be discussing is the drastically different draft of Godzilla written by Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, adapted for an American audience.
And this would have been before the 90s one, right?
Yes. My decision behind this is that because of the story of Gojira making its way to the US and was changed to the Godzilla King of the Monsters, many of the same elements kind of parallel each other, which make for a very relevant comparison.
Yeah.
So yeah, that'll be the end of part 1 of Godzilla, the history of Godzilla. In the next episode, we will be going into the unmade Godzilla movie before we get into the Roland Emmerich movie, which I will also be including production stories behind that, just because so much of it is really interesting as to the decisions that they made for that film.
All right. We'll see you back here for part 2 then. In the meantime, if you want to find more episodes of this podcast, you can go check out our website, pipedreampodcast.com, where you can find links to our social media pages and email address. We're on Twitter at HDTNGM. We're on Instagram at HowDidThisNotGetMade. And you can send us your emails, notgetmade@gmail.com, with any corrections or anything we've missed. I'm sure we have a Godzilla superfan out there who will probably want to add a whole lot of more information.
Yeah.
While you're there, you can also check out our Patreon page. We're so thankful for everybody who donates on Patreon. You can get access to a special monthly show, as well as all of the notes for each episode that we record. That's going to go ahead and wrap us up for today. So thank you, everybody, so much for listening.
Thank you.
Godzilla!